The morning Eudora Bailey rode into Caldwell, Kansas, she did it alone, on a horse that was not hers, with a rifle across her lap and no apology whatsoever for either fact. It was the spring of 1879, and the cattle town of Caldwell sat right at the edge of the Cherokee Strip like a wound that refused to close. Dust coated everything. The saloon never really slept. Cowboys drifted in from the long drives up the Kishom Trail, smelling of cattle and sweat and weeks of open sky, and they spent their wages in 2 days flat before riding back out to do it all over again. It was a hard place, built by hard people, and it had very little patience for anything it did not already understand. Eudora Bailey was something it did not already understand. She was 26 years old, broad-shouldered for a woman, with dark copper hair she kept pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat that had seen considerably better days. Her eyes were the pale gray of a sky before a storm, and they had the same quality. You could look at them and feel something shifting, feel the air changing pressure, feel that something was coming whether you were ready for it or not. She wore a practical split skirt that let her ride astride, which alone was enough to draw stares in Caldwell. The rifle on her lap drew the rest of them. She tied the horse, a big roan gelding she had borrowed from her neighbor, old Mr. Hatch, with his blessing and a jar of salted pork for the road, to the hitching post outside the land office, and walked inside like she owned the building, and was simply deciding whether to keep it. The land agent was a soft man named Gerald Prout, with a mustache he clearly cared about more than anything else in his life. He looked up from his papers, looked at Eudora, looked back at his papers, then looked at her again as though hoping she might have transformed into something more familiar in the interim. "I need to file a claim," Eudora said. 160 acres. Section 14 east of the creek. Gerald Prout set down his pen. "Ma'am," he started. "Miss," she corrected. He blinked. "Miss, are you, that is to say, is there a husband or a father?" "There is not," Eudora said. "But I have the filing fee, the correct form already filled out, and the legal right to claim land under the Homestead Act of 1862, which does not, as I understand it, require a husband or a father. It requires a head of household who is 21 years or older and a citizen of the United States. I am 26. I was born in Ohio, and I have lived alone on a 40-acre parcel in Sumner County for the past 3 years. I qualify on every count." Gerald Prout's mustache twitched. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he took her paperwork, reviewed it with the expression of a man hoping to find an error and finding none, and stamped it. "Congratulations," he said, with all the warmth of a man handing over something he believed would shortly be taken back from her by the natural order of things. Eudora thanked him. She had been raised with manners, even if she'd chosen which ones to keep, and walked back out into the afternoon sun. That was when she nearly walked directly into Silas Ashford. He was stepping up onto the boardwalk from the street just as she was coming through the door of the land office, and they did a brief, awkward dance, both of them sidestepping the same direction twice before he stopped and held up his hands in surrender and grinned. "Pardon me," he said. She looked at him. He was tall, not unusually so, but tall enough that she had to tilt her chin slightly, which she was not accustomed to doing. He was maybe 30, 31, with a lean face burned brown by years under an open sky, dark hair gone slightly long at the collar, and green eyes that were doing something she did not immediately have a word for. They were not looking at her the way most men in Caldwell looked at her. They were looking at her the way a person looks at a painting that surprises them with attention and something like respect. He wore a good hat, worn at the brim from long use. A deputy's star was pinned to his vest. "Miss," he said, touching the brim of the hat. "Deputy," she said, and walked past him. She heard him pause behind her on the boardwalk. She did not look back. She never looked back. It was one of the things people said about her, one of the many things people said about her, most of them delivered with a shake of the head. She was proud, they said. She was unbiddable. She would not be told. She would not be guided. She would not be softened into something easier to manage. She rode back out to her new claim with the stamped paperwork tucked inside her coat and the afternoon light turning gold across the Kansas grass, and she let herself feel, for exactly 1 mile and no longer, the deep satisfaction of a thing accomplished against resistance. Then she started thinking about water. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of Section 14 was shared. She knew that from the survey map. It bordered Section 15 on the other side, and Section 15 already had a claimant. She had seen his name in the county records when she'd done her research. Ashford. S. Ashford. She did not yet connect that name to the green-eyed deputy on the boardwalk. She would, in 3 days. The land that Eudora had claimed was not broken yet. It was raw Kansas prairie, bluestem grass running waist-high in the low spots, a few cottonwoods along the creek bank, and soil that was black and deep and rich enough to make your heart ache if you knew what it could become. She had a tent for the first nights, a good iron stove she'd brought in the wagon she'd hired from Caldwell, and enough seed corn and vegetable seed to get something in the ground if she moved quickly. Spring in Kansas was a narrow window. Miss it and you lost a year. She did not intend to lose a year. She spent the first day staking out the corners of a small cabin 12 by 16 feet, which was modest but tight and defensible in hers. She had learned to use a broadex from her father before he died, and she was not bad at it. She had already made arrangements with a sawmill 20 miles east for cut lumber to be delivered in a week. Until then, she worked what she had. On the second day, she found the fence. It ran right along the creek bank, a barbed wire fence that someone had strung on the wrong side of the property line, her side. It cut her off from the creek by a good 30 feet, swallowing a strip of her best bottomland with it. She walked the fence line twice, checking her survey stakes, checking her map. There was no ambiguity. The fence was wrong. It encroached on her property by 30 feet for a stretch of nearly a quarter mile. She followed the fence line north until she found where it turned and ran east across open ground, and then she found the man repairing a post 60 yards away. He was crouched in the grass with a post-hole digger, working a new cedar post into the ground with the concentrated attention of someone who liked doing things correctly. He had his hat off and his sleeves rolled up, and when he stood to see who was coming, she recognized him. The deputy from the boardwalk, S. Ashford. He shaded his eyes with one hand. "Miss Bailey," he said, which surprised her because she had not told him her name. "You know who I am," she said. "Land office talks," he said, setting down the post-hole digger. "I heard someone filed on Section 14. I meant to ride over and introduce myself. I'm your neighbor on 15. He extended his hand. "Silas Ashford." She shook it. His grip was firm but not testing. "This fence," she said, "is on my land." Something moved across his face, not guilt, which was what she had been braced for. It looked more like genuine surprise. "What do you mean?" "I mean it's on my land," she said again, because she had found in her experience that repeating yourself with the same certainty was more effective than explaining yourself in greater detail to someone who might be hoping you'd talk yourself into uncertainty. "It runs 30 feet onto Section 14 for a quarter mile along the creek. I have my survey." He looked at the fence, then looked back at her. "I didn't string this fence," he said. "I bought this claim from a man named Denton 14 months ago. The fence was already here." "Then Denton strung it wrong," she said, "or strung it intentionally. Either way, it needs to come down." Silas Ashford was quiet for a moment. He had that quality she sometimes saw in men who were genuinely confident. They didn't bluster when surprised. They just got still and thought. It was rarer than it should have been. "Do you have your survey with you?" he asked. She pulled the folded paper from her coat pocket and held it out to him. He took it, studied it for a long moment, then walked 50 feet to where one of her stakes was still visible in the ground, looked from the stake to the fence to the map and back again. "You're right," he said. He handed the survey back. "I'll have it down by the end of the week." She blinked. She had been prepared for argument. She had prepared 3 separate rebuttals in her head on the walk over. "That's all," she said. "That's all," he said. "It's your land. I'm not going to argue with a survey." He paused. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience. If you want, I'll have my ranch hand crews help you fill in the post holes once we're done, so it doesn't leave your creek bank looking like a rabbit warren." Eudora folded her survey map with precision. "I can fill my own post holes," she said. The corner of his mouth did something, not quite a smile, close to one. "I believe you," he said. She walked back to her land. She told herself, later that evening, while she cooked beans over the camp stove and the stars came out over the Kansas plain in their extravagant numbers, that she felt nothing particular about Silas Ashford. He was simply a neighbor who had, upon being confronted with evidence, done the correct thing. That was the bare minimum of decent behavior and deserved no special notice. She told herself this quite firmly and with great conviction. She thought about his eyes for most of the night anyway. The fence came down in 3 days, not 1 week. She saw the activity from her claim, 2 figures working along the creek bank, pulling posts, rolling wire. She did not go over. She had her own work to do. The lumber had arrived a day early and she was deep in the foundation work for the cabin, which was slow because she was doing it alone. She was fitting a corner log when she heard hooves behind her, turned with her broadaxe still in her hand, and found Silas Ashford sitting his horse at a respectful distance, watching. He had brought 2 men with him, a young Mexican vaquero with quick dark eyes who she would later learn was Cruz Vega, and an older man with a gray beard who went by the name Patch. They had post-hole diggers, lumber tools, and the calm, competent look of men who knew which end of a hammer to hold. "We're done with the fence," Silas said. "I thought if you'd accept the help, we could square up the cabin foundation before dark. 4 people are faster than 1. Eudora looked at him. She looked at Cruz and Patch. She looked at the corner she'd been fighting with for 3 hours. She was proud, genuinely, bone-deep proud, and she knew it. She had never thought of it as a flaw. Pride was what had kept her going after her father died and left her the 40-acre parcel with a mortgage on it and neighbors who'd smiled while they waited for her to fail. Pride had gotten her through 3 Kansas winters alone, and a lawsuit from a man who had tried to claim her well was on shared property. Pride was the thing that stood between her and a world that moved very quickly to fill the space left by a woman on her own, but she was not stupid, and there was a difference between accepting unnecessary help and refusing sensible help out of stubbornness, and she had always tried to know where that line was. "All right," she said, "but I'm working alongside you. I'm not standing aside while it gets done around me." Silas swung down from the horse. "I wouldn't expect anything else," he said. They worked until the sun was low and red over the western horizon. Cruz turned out to be fast and precise, which she respected. Patch was slow but never wrong, which she respected more. And Silas worked like he thought about it, like he understood why each piece went where it did, and he had a way of moving around her that was considerate without being deferential, which was a distinction she appreciated enormously. He did not hover. He did not insert himself between her and the difficult tasks. When she was doing something and he could see a better approach, he said so simply and waited to see if she'd take it, and when she did not, he let it go. When the last of the good light faded, they had 3 walls of the foundation set and plumb. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it without qualification. Cruz nodded graciously. Patch said, "Pleasure, miss," and went to water the horses. Silas lingered, which she noticed, and she allowed herself to notice it without making it into more than it was. "How long have you been in Kansas?" he asked. She was cleaning the broadaxe, wiping the head with an oilcloth. 3 years on my original parcel," she said. "Before that, Ohio. Before that, 4 years in Missouri with my father." "What brought you here?" "Land," she said simply. "My own land, more of it. That's what I've been working toward." She paused. "My father believed women should own property. He taught me everything he knew about farming and surveying and law. He said the world would try to take things from me that were rightfully mine, and the only defense was to know more than the people trying to take them." Silas was quiet for a moment. In the growing dusk, his expression was hard to read fully, but she thought she saw something serious and attentive there. "He sounds like a good man," he said. "He was," she said. She did not elaborate. He did not press. They stood for a moment in the comfortable quiet of people who are testing whether silence between them is easy or difficult, and it turned out to be easy, which was significant in the way that easy things between near strangers always are. It meant something was already there that hadn't needed to be built. He said goodnight and rode back across the creek with Cruz and Patch behind him, and Eudora Bailey went inside her tent and lay on her cot and stared at the canvas ceiling. Pride, she thought. Yes. And enough sense to know that a good neighbor was worth more than a principled grudge. Summer came into Kansas like it always did, without warning and without mercy. The heat came off the flat land in waves that shimmered, and the creek dropped 2 feet in July, and the grass went tawny and crackling at the edges, and Eudora worked through all of it with the focused, furious energy of someone who understood that the work you did in the good years was the wall you hid behind in the bad ones. Her cabin was finished in June, small and solid, and genuinely hers in the way that things you build with your own hands always are. She had a kitchen garden running along the south wall, corn in the lower field, and she had acquired 2 chickens and a milk cow from a woman in Caldwell who was leaving Kansas with her family for Oregon, and those animals were doing well enough. She had also, over the course of those summer months, developed something with Silas Ashford that she would not have called friendship exactly, because friendship felt too managed a word for it, too deliberately constructed. It was more like the way the creek between their properties ran through both their lands without asking permission. It was simply there, naturally, doing what water does. He rode over 2 or 3 times a week. Sometimes with a reason, a question about the county water access rules, a report of cattle being driven through the section by strangers, a half-side of venison from a deer Cruz had taken, offered with the straightforward generosity of a rancher who had more meat than he could use before it turned. Sometimes without one. Sometimes he simply appeared at the fence line, leaned on the post, and talked. He was from Virginia, originally Western Virginia, the mountains, which explained something about the way he carried himself, that quality of a man used to terrain that required him to find his own footing. He'd come west after the war. She did not ask which side he'd fought on, and he did not volunteer it, which was the only sensible way to handle that subject in a town as mixed as Caldwell. He'd worked as a cattle drover for 5 years, then as a deputy in Wichita, then in Caldwell. He'd bought the Section 15 claim because he was tired of working other people's land and other people's law, and he wanted something of his own. "You understand that," he said one afternoon, leaning on her fence while she worked her kitchen garden, and it was not a question. "I understand that completely," she said. "I thought you would," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, like he had been certain of it in advance, like he had already known this about her before she confirmed it, that made her stop hoeing for a moment and look at him directly. He was looking at her the same way he had that first day on the boardwalk, with that attentiveness. That quality of someone who was not looking through her at some idea of her, but was looking at her specifically, seeing her specifically, Eudora Bailey specifically, with her sunburned nose and her dirty hands and her precise, careful opinions about drainage and soil amendments. She went back to hoeing. But her heart was doing something a little irregular, and she noticed it, and she did not have a word for it yet, but she was beginning to feel fairly confident she would find one. In August, there was trouble. It started with the Corliss brothers, which was where most trouble in that part of Sumner County started. There were 3 of them, Owen, Thomas, and young Ray, who was 18 and trying hard to be as mean as his brothers and not quite succeeding. They ran cattle on a large, unfenced range to the northwest, and they had a habit of letting that cattle drift wherever the grass was good without much regard for who owned the grass in question. They had been letting their cattle drift onto Section 14 since spring, and Eudora had been chasing them off 3 or 4 times a week since May, which she did efficiently and without drama, turning the animals with her horse and a great deal of noise and patience. But in August, the Corliss brothers decided they were tired of their cattle being chased and rode over to address the matter personally. Owen Corliss was a large man who believed that size was an argument in itself. He and Thomas rode up to Eudora's cabin on a Wednesday afternoon, and Owen did the talking, which consisted mainly of explaining to her, from horseback, that women who had no business running their own land ought to sell up and move on, and that if she persisted in chasing his cattle, she would regret it in ways he was currently too polite to specify. Eudora had listened to this from her porch with her arms crossed, and her expression that of a woman who is letting someone demonstrate something she has been expecting. When Owen finished, she said, "Your cattle are eating my corn. I have a legal right under Kansas property law to impound any trespassing livestock, charge a fee for their keep, and bill the owner for any damage to crops. The next time I find your cattle on my land, that is exactly what I will do, and I will be presenting the bill at the county courthouse, not directly to you, because I do not negotiate with men who use threats where evidence ought to be." Owen Corliss's face did something unpleasant. He said several things she did not care to repeat. He also, in the process of turning his horse, knocked over the fence post at the corner of her yard, which she was fairly certain was deliberate. He rode off. She went inside, loaded her rifle, and did not sleep especially well that night. The next morning, Silas Ashford appeared before she had finished her coffee. He had heard in the way that things always traveled in small communities, and he was not pleased. His green eyes had a quality she hadn't seen in them before, a flat, controlled anger, the kind that burns cold rather than hot. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said. "I've handled worse." "I know you have," he said. "I'm not asking because I think you can't. I'm asking because I want to know." She looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup. There was a difference, she thought. There really was a difference between being asked because someone doubted you and being asked because someone cared about you. She had spent so long dealing with the former that the latter occasionally took her a moment to recognize. "I'm fine," she said again, softer this time. "They're bullies. Bullies perform. If you don't flinch for the performance, they usually move on to easier targets." "Usually," Silas said. "Usually," she agreed. He sat down on her porch step without being invited, which meant he was comfortable enough to stop being formal, which meant something. "I'm going to pay a visit to Owen Corliss today," he said. "Not as your neighbor, as the deputy. You don't have to." "I know I don't," he said, "but they were on your property and they made threatening statements. That is in fact my job." A pause. "And also I want to." Eudora looked at him for a long moment. The morning light was coming from the east, coming right across the creek and through the cottonwood leaves, and it caught in the green of his eyes and turned them something warmer. She noticed this. She noticed it in a way that felt important. "Be careful," she said. "The Corliss brothers have friends in this county." "I know their friends," he said. "I also know their debts and their outstanding warrants from Wichita, which is a more useful kind of knowledge." He left her there with her coffee, mounted his horse, and rode north. She watched him go. She thought about it for 3 days before she admitted to herself that what she felt when she watched him ride away was something she had not felt before. It was not the manageable fondness she had felt for 1 or 2 other men in her life, men she had liked but not in any way that had threatened to rearrange her. It was something larger and less convenient, something with edges, something that sat in the center of her chest like a stone she was constantly aware of. She was proud. She knew this about herself and did not apologize for it. But she was also, if she was honest, and she was always honest, it was another thing people said about her, another thing delivered with exasperation. She was also occasionally lonely. The solitude of her life was something she had chosen, and she did not regret it, but she was adult enough to understand that choosing to be alone was not the same as preferring it in every particular. It was the safest choice, given the world and what it did to women who depended on men for their standing. But safety was not everything. The Corliss situation resolved more quietly than she had expected. Silas came back from his visit with a signed agreement that Owen Corliss would fence his own cattle off from sections 14 and 15 within 30 days, backed by the threat of the Wichita warrants which Owen apparently did not want surfaced. Silas reported this to her without triumph, as a simple matter of business conducted, and she appreciated that too, the absence of performance. "Thank you," she said, genuinely. "You said that before," he said. "I meant it before," she said. "I mean it now." He looked at her in that particular way again, and this time she did not look away as quickly as she usually did. Autumn in Kansas was the kindest season. The heat broke, the sky turned a deep impossible blue, and the grass went gold and amber, and the cottonwoods along the creek dropped their leaves in slow, spinning curtains. Eudora had her corn in, her garden put up, her root cellar stocked, and her firewood split and stacked 8 feet high along the north wall of the cabin. She was ready for winter. She had learned to be ready for winter. She was splitting the last of a wood delivery on a Saturday afternoon when she heard music coming from across the creek. Not much music, a fiddle, played in the way that someone plays who has not played in a long time, a little uncertain in the runs but true in the tone. It was a waltz, slow and slightly melancholy, and it drifted across the water and through the cottonwood leaves and found her at her woodpile and did something to her that a piece of music had not done in a long time. She put down the axe. She washed her hands. She crossed the creek at the shallow crossing they had both taken to using, not quite thinking about what she was doing. Silas was on his own porch. He had the fiddle under his chin and his eyes were closed, and he did not hear her come up the path until she was almost at the porch steps, and then he stopped and lowered the fiddle and looked at her with an expression that was the first genuinely unguarded one she had seen on him. "I didn't know you played," she said. "I haven't much," he said. "Not in years." He turned the fiddle in his hands. "It was my mother's. I've been thinking about her lately. She used to play on the porch in the evenings." "It's beautiful," Eudora said. "Don't stop on my account." He looked at her. Something shifted. "Sit down," he said, not an order, an invitation. The difference was always in the tone, and she heard it clearly. She sat in the other porch chair and he played. He played the waltz through to the end, and then he played something else, a slow reel that gradually picked up speed until the melancholy was gone from it entirely, and it was just fast and bright and alive. And she watched his hands on the strings and his face while he played, the way it was open in a way it wasn't usually, the way the music let something through that the rest of his careful self kept back. When he stopped, the silence was full. "You have a look on your face I haven't seen before," he said. "What look?" "Like you've made up your mind about something," he said. She considered denying this. She was good at denial, she'd had practice. But she found, sitting on Silas Ashford's porch in the Kansas autumn with the smell of creek water and cottonwood and wood smoke all around her, that she was tired of denying this particular thing. "I like you," she said, simply, directly, in the way she handled most things, which was to look at them straight on and call them what they were. "I've been resisting it because I don't find it convenient." He set the fiddle carefully on the porch railing. He turned to look at her fully. "Why isn't it convenient?" he asked, and his voice had a quality in it she had not heard there before, either careful and wanting. "Because I have spent 3 years making certain that everything in my life depends on me and nothing else," she said. "Because I have watched what happens to women who allow themselves to depend on men, and most of what I've watched has not been encouraging. Because I worked very hard to become the kind of person who doesn't need saving, and I am not willing to unmake that." He was quiet. She appreciated that he did not immediately rush in with reassurances. He sat with what she had said, turned it over, treated it like what it was, a serious statement deserving a serious response. "I don't want to save you," he said finally. "I have seen you chase 100 head of longhorns off your property by yourself at 7 in the morning while drinking coffee. You do not need saving." A pause. "But I think, and I could be wrong, and you will tell me if I am, that neither of us is better for being entirely alone. And I think there is something between us that is worth investigating if you're willing." Eudora looked at the creek silver in the late afternoon light. She looked at the sky. She looked at him. "I'm willing," she said. What happened after that was not dramatic in the way that things in novels are dramatic. It was something quieter and more real. They began spending evenings together, sometimes at her place, sometimes at his. They talked about everything and were comfortable in the silences between everything. He brought her the Topeka newspaper when he rode into Caldwell, because she had mentioned she missed the habit of reading it. She brought him pickled vegetables from her root cellar, and once, memorably, a lemon cake she had made from a recipe her mother had written in the back of a Bible that she carried everywhere, because she had learned he had a weakness for sweets that he was slightly embarrassed about. He told her about the war. He had fought for the Union, which she had suspected from things he'd said, and he had come west afterward because Virginia was not the same place he'd left, and he was not the same person who had left it, and neither he nor Virginia had quite known what to do with the other. She told him about Missouri, about her father's death, about the mortgage and the years of working and refusing to give up the 40 acres, about all the men who had predicted she'd fail, and the specific satisfaction of proving them wrong. "You were described," he said one evening in early November, sitting by her kitchen stove with snow beginning to come down outside, the first real snow of the season, settling soft and heavy on the brown grass. "You were described to me when I first asked about who had filed on 14 as proud and unbiddable." She raised her eyebrows. "Who described me that way?" "Gerald Prout," he said, "at the land office. He seemed to think those were marks against you." "And what did you think?" she said. He looked at her across the kitchen table, and his expression was something she could not entirely name yet, but was beginning to understand as particular to him, that quality of seeing her clearly and being glad about what he saw. "I thought they sounded like exactly the qualities I'd been looking for all along," he said. "I've spent too many years watching people be managed and maneuvered out of what should have been theirs. I don't want someone who goes along with things because it's easier. I've never wanted that." A pause. "I want someone who knows her own mind and isn't afraid to speak it." Eudora looked at him for a long, still moment. "That is either the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me," she said, "or a very good line." "It's honest," he said. "I don't have any good lines. Ask Cruz." She laughed. She had a full, real laugh, not a social laugh, not a polite one, and he looked at the sound of it like a man hearing something he had been waiting to hear. She was still smiling when she said, "Silas, Eudora, stop looking at me like that." "Like what?" "Like I'm something that surprises you." "You do surprise me," he said. "Every day." A pause. "I think you'll keep doing it." "Probably," she said. "Good," he said. "I like it." The snow came down heavier outside, and the stove was warm, and they sat there in her kitchen and talked until it was too late for him to ride home safely, and she gave him the spare quilt, and he slept on her floor, which was perfectly proper. And in the morning she made coffee and eggs, and they watched the snow on the Kansas plain together from her porch in the cold, wrapped in separate coats, close enough that their shoulders were touching. Neither of them moved away. Winter deepened in the way that Kansas winters do, not gradually, but all at once, as though someone had simply decided that enough time had been wasted on moderation. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a single night, the creek froze solid from bank to bank, and the wind came off the open plain carrying nothing to stop it between there and the Rockies, which were several hundred miles of nothing in particular away. Eudora managed her winter as she managed everything, with preparation and refusal to panic. Her firewood held. Her root cellar held. Her animals were in a small, solid barn she had built in the fall, and they were warm enough. She had her books. She had a good collection for a woman on the frontier, collected over years with careful spending, and her sewing and her rifle and her own company, which she had always found sufficient. But she also had Silas now. Not in the cabin. She was not reckless with her reputation in a way that would give people actual ammunition to use against her, and he respected this completely without being asked. But he was close. He checked on her every 2 or 3 days throughout December, appearing through the snow on his horse like a figure from a painting, and she found she looked forward to it in a way she had not expected. They read to each other. He had a copy of Dickens' Bleak House that he had been carrying around unread for 2 years, and she had strong opinions about Dickens, which led to one of the most genuinely enjoyable arguments of either of their lives, conducted over 2 evenings with great energy and occasional laughter. He had opinions too. That was something she continued to appreciate, that he was not blank, not agreeable in that hollow way of men who told women what they wanted to hear. He disagreed with her about Dickens. He disagreed with her about the best approach to dryland corn farming, which she found irritating because he was actually right, and she had to look up the reference he cited before she could confirm it, which took 2 days of being internally annoyed. He disagreed with her about whether Cruz Vega's planned wedding to a girl in town was happening too quickly. She said it was. He said that when you knew, you knew, and he said it with a steadiness that she understood was not only about Cruz. She understood it. She felt it herself, the knowing. It was a large thing to know. It was not a thing she had been expecting when she rode into Caldwell in the spring with her rifle on her lap and her stamped paperwork and her complete and entire intention to need no one. But it was there. It was as there as the creek, as real and present and not going anywhere. In January, the worst blizzard in 3 years came down out of the north. Eudora was prepared for most of it, but the wind took a section of her barn roof that she had not been able to repair before the freeze set in. Had not been able to because the lumber had not arrived in time, which was one of the things that happened when you were running a homestead on a careful budget with no margin for delay. The animals were exposed. Not dangerously, not immediately, but if another night like that hit, it could go badly. Silas was there within 2 hours of the storm breaking. He came on snowshoes, which she had not known he owned, with a roll of canvas and rope and Cruz behind him carrying lumber. They worked in the wreckage of the wind with frozen fingers and the temperature still well below zero, and by midday the barn was covered and the animals were secured. She worked alongside them the entire time. She was not going to stand inside while other people solved her problems, not even now. Silas knew this and had not suggested otherwise. He simply handed her the end of a canvas strap and showed her the knot he was using, and they worked the problem together. When it was done and they were inside her cabin with her kettle on and their coats steaming by the stove, Cruz said something in Spanish that she did not fully catch, but she caught Silas's name and she caught the tone, which was affectionate and teasing, and Silas said something back that made Cruz grin and hold up his hands in surrender. "What did he say?" she asked. Silas picked up his coffee cup. "He said I look happy." "And what did you say?" He looked at her across the cabin. "I said he wasn't wrong," he said. Cruz, with great tactfulness, found somewhere else to be shortly after the coffee was finished. Eudora and Silas were alone in her small, warm cabin with the blizzard rattling at the windows and the stove glowing orange and the steam rising from 2 cups of coffee between them. "Eudora," he said. "Yes," she said. "I'd like to ask you something," he said. "And before I do, I want to say whatever your answer is, nothing changes. We are what we are regardless. I'm not asking in order to change anything. I'm asking because I think it's the honest next thing to do." She set down her coffee cup. Her heart was doing that thing again, that irregular, significant thing. "Ask," she said. "Will you marry me?" he said. He said it simply, the way he said most important things, without performance, without elaborate staging, just directly looking at her. "I have thought about this since October. I have thought about whether it is what I want, and it is. I have thought about whether it would be good for you, and I believe it would be, though you are the authority on what is good for you, and I will respect whatever you decide. I have thought about what it would mean to be married to a woman like you, proud and unbiddable, as advertised, and I think it would mean my life was considerably better than it would otherwise be." A pause. "I love you. I should have said that first. I love you, and I'd very much like to build something with you." The blizzard pressed against the windows. The stove crackled. Eudora Bailey looked at the man across her kitchen table, this careful, direct, green-eyed man who had never once tried to manage her, who had taken down a fence because it was hers by right, who had played his mother's fiddle for her in the autumn light, who had worked in a blizzard with frozen hands to repair her barn without once suggesting she owed him anything for it, who had told a land agent's careless insult and turned it into something he meant as praise. "I love you too," she said. "I have for months. She paused. "I've been working up to saying it. "I know," he said. "I've been watching you work up to it." "Was it obvious?" "Only to me," he said. "And possibly to Cruz," she laughed. And then she said, "Yes, yes, I'll marry you." He reached across the table and took her hand in both of his, and she let him, and they sat like that in the warm kitchen while the blizzard ran itself out against the walls of her cabin, which held. They were married in March of 1880 in the Caldwell courthouse, with Cruz and his new wife Maria as witnesses and Patch standing in the back looking sentimental. Gerald Prout was not invited. The ceremony was short and the judge was efficient, and Eudora wore her best dress, which was blue wool and which she had made herself the previous winter, and Silas wore a clean vest and had clearly had his hair cut recently and looked, Cruz said afterward, like a man who had finally arrived somewhere he'd been riding toward for a very long time. They had discussed the property at length before the wedding, which was not romantic but was practical and important. Eudora had insisted that Section 14 remain in her name, hers alone, filed under her name at the land office, and Silas had agreed to this without hesitation or negotiation, because it was right. Section 15 was in his name. 2 separate claims, 2 separate records, held by 2 people who had chosen each other but had not dissolved into each other, and that was how they both wanted it. "We're neighbors who are also married," Cruz said, which made everyone laugh, but it was not wrong. They moved into Silas's cabin because it was larger, but they spent as much time in hers, and the division of labor that emerged between them was natural and based on ability and inclination rather than assumption. She was better at bookkeeping, and he knew it and let her keep the books. He was better at long-distance riding, and she sent him to Wichita for supplies that required the trip. She was better at handling livestock and the detail work of it, the sick animal, the difficult birth, the daily care, and he was better at large-scale fence repair, which he liked because it was solitary and gave him time to think. They discovered these things about each other in the way that people who are paying attention always do, through watching and asking and adjusting, without deciding in advance what things were supposed to look like. It was, Eudora thought, in the late spring evenings of 1880, sitting on the joined porch they had built between the 2 properties, watching the sun go down over the grass. It was the best thing she had built. And she had built several things she was proud of. Summer brought new complications and new joys in about equal measure, which was how summer on the frontier generally operated. The complications included a prolonged dry spell that cost them both significant portions of their gardens, and worried them about the corn, a dispute with the county over water rights that Eudora navigated through 6 weeks of correspondence, and 1 trip to Topeka that resulted in a settlement entirely in their favor, and a brief outbreak of some illness among the cattle on the Corliss Range that drifted to their north pasture fence and required careful management. The Corliss brothers had fenced their cattle as agreed, but they were still unpleasant neighbors in the ambient way of unpleasant people who have been forced to comply and have not forgiven it. Eudora found that she no longer found them particularly frightening, which was interesting. Being loved by someone who was genuinely capable and genuinely on your side turned out to be its own kind of armor. The joys included the corn coming through despite the dry spell stronger than either of them had expected. Because they had planted drought-resistant varieties, Eudora had researched through the Agricultural College Extension, which she had been corresponding with for 2 years. They included the first full harvest from her east field, which was better than her projections. They included Cruz and Maria's announcement that they were expecting a child in January, which was celebrated with considerable enthusiasm. And they included, in late September, Eudora's own discovery that she was expecting, which she told Silas on the same porch where he had played his mother's fiddle for her a year earlier, in the same autumn light, and his face had done something she had never quite seen a face do, a kind of total, unguarded gladness, moving through him like the sun coming from behind a cloud. He had taken her hands and held them and not said anything for a long moment, and then he had said, "Eudora," in a voice that contained everything. "I know," she said. "Are you?" "I'm well," she said. "I'm healthy and strong, and I have every intention of continuing to be all of those things." "I know you do," he said. "I'm not worried about that." "What are you feeling?" she asked. "Like I could ride to the top of every hill in Kansas and yell about it," he said. "Please don't," she said. "The neighbors would talk." He laughed and gathered her into his arms, and she let him, resting her head against his shoulder and looking out over the creek, gold and low in the autumn light, running between their two pieces of land with its usual independence, and she felt something that she did not fully have a word for, something that was not the same as happiness exactly, because happiness was too simple a word for it. It was more like completion. Not the completion of lacking something and now having it. She had never lacked herself, and she would not allow herself to be described that way. But the completion of a thing that had always been whole becoming also, now, shared. The winter of 1880 into 1881 was the winter they lived through together as fully married people, which was different from the winter of watching and becoming. There was a settled quality to it, a warmth that was not only from the stove. They had moved her best furniture into his larger cabin, their cabin now, though she still thought of both structures as hers in the particular way she thought of all things she had built or earned or fought for. The cabin was full of their combined life, her books and his fiddle, her mother's Bible and his Virginia hat that he never actually wore but could not throw away, her iron stove, and his good set of Virginia horse tools that his father had given him before he went to war. The child came in April of 1881, 3 days before the deadline Eudora had privately decided was reasonable, which she chose to regard as the child's first act of cooperation. He was a boy, small and loud and furiously healthy, and they named him Thomas, after Silas's father, with Bailey as a middle name, which was Eudora's suggestion and Silas's immediate acceptance. Thomas Bailey Ashford came into the world in the same bedroom where his parents slept, delivered by a midwife from Caldwell named Helen Marsh, who was competent and calm, and who told Eudora afterward that she was one of the easiest patients she'd had in years, which Eudora accepted as a compliment, and which Helen meant entirely as one. Silas held his son for the first time in the morning light, sitting on the edge of the bed, and looked down at the boy with an expression of such unguarded tenderness that Eudora, watching from the pillow, felt her chest ache with the excess of feeling that was apparently now her daily condition. "He looks like you," Silas said. "He looks like a baby," Eudora said. "They all look like babies." "He's going to be stubborn," Silas said. "Yes," she said. "I believe so." "Good," he said. "It's a useful quality." Spring and summer of 1881 passed in a particular kind of fullness that Eudora, who had been excellent at managing her solitude, found required a complete reorganization of her understanding of what she wanted from a day. Thomas was present and demanding in the specific way of babies, which was unignorable. Cruz's son, Eduardo, had been born in January, and the two infants regarded each other from their respective blankets, with the serious concentration of very small people who are gathering information. Maria and Eudora became genuinely close over those months in the way that women on the frontier who are caring for children near each other become close. A friendship built from necessity and practicality that turned, with time and honesty, into something they would have chosen anyway. Silas continued his work as a deputy through that year, which Eudora accepted as his right to continue the work he was good at, and she continued to expand her farming operation, which she was also good at. She broke new ground on the east field and planted sorghum, which turned out to be exactly right for that section of soil, and she made a profit in the fall of 1881 that was larger than either of her previous 2 harvests combined. She put most of it into improvements and kept a portion in the bank in Caldwell, in her name, which was not common practice, but was her practice, and no one who knew Eudora Bailey Ashford well enough was going to argue with her about it. The land, her 160 acres of Section 14, continued to improve under her care. She was systematic about it in the way her father had taught her, rotating crops, enriching the soil, keeping careful records of what worked and what didn't across years. By 1882, it was producing reliably enough that she had begun to think about expansion, about the adjacent section that was still unclaimed, about what she might do with another 160 acres if she had the time and the capital. She had both. She had worked carefully to ensure she had both. Silas was watching her one evening in the early summer of 1882 while she worked through her ledger books at the kitchen table, Thomas asleep in his small bed in the back room, the evening air coming through the open window carrying the smell of the creek and the grass, and he had the expression she recognized by now as the particular one he wore when he was thinking something significant. "What is it?" she said, without looking up from the ledger. "I've been thinking about quitting the deputy work," he said. Now she looked up. "Tell me why," she said. Not because she disapproved or approved, but because she wanted to know his reasoning, the way she always wanted to know his reasoning before she offered her own opinion. "Because I have enough here," he said. "The ranch is doing well. We're doing well. I got into law work because I needed the income and I believed in the work, and both of those things remain true, but I've been thinking that what I want to build is here." He gestured not at the cabin specifically, but at everything beyond it, the land, the creek, the two properties. "I want to be here more. I want to be here when Thomas is growing up. I want to be here with you." He paused. "I also think you're about to expand to Section 16, and it's going to require more hands, and I'd rather be one of them than hire someone else." Eudora looked at him for a long moment. He was 33 now, and the years of open sky work had not aged him badly. He was weathered in the way that made a person look solid rather than worn, with threads of gray starting at his temples that she found she liked unreasonably much. "I was thinking about Section 16, she confirmed. "I know," he said. "I've been watching you watch it." "How long have you been watching me watch it?" "Since February," he said. She shook her head slowly, but she was smiling. "You could mention," she said, "that you want to be here more. You don't have to dress it up in logistics." "Both things are true," he said, "the logistics and the wanting." "I know," she said. "Come here." He came and she stood up from the table, and he put his arms around her and she put hers around him, and they stood in their kitchen for a long, quiet moment. And outside the window the Kansas evening was settling into blue, and the creek was running, and somewhere across the water a meadowlark was singing its elaborate, unhurried song. "Quit the deputy work," she said, against his shoulder. "Come home." "All right," he said. He gave his notice in July, and by August he was home full-time, and the adjustment was, like most adjustments in their life, one that required some negotiation and patience, and resulted in something better than what either of them had imagined separately. Section 16 was filed in Eudora's name in September of 1882, 240 acres now, a fact that she permitted herself to feel very good about for approximately a week before moving on to the next thing that needed doing. Thomas at 18 months was a serious child with his mother's gray eyes, and his father's way of going still and watching before he acted. He was walking by then, steadily and with great purpose, and he had a particular fondness for the chickens, which he pursued with a focused dedication that the chickens found alarming. He was already, Silas said, his mother's son. He was going to know his own mind very early and very completely. "Is that a warning or a compliment?" Eudora said. "It's an observation," Silas said, "and it's wonderful." The years between 1882 and 1885 were years of building. They were not dramatic years in the sense of high crisis. There was weather, there was market fluctuation, there was the ongoing background noise of Kansas frontier life, which included everything from prairie fires that came within a mile of their north fence in the summer of 1883, to a brief and unsuccessful attempt by a land speculator from Kansas City to buy up parcels in their section at below-market rates, which Eudora addressed by organizing her neighbors into a collective refusal so efficient and well-documented that the speculator left within 2 weeks. Silas had watched this process from a respectful distance, and told her afterward that it was among the most impressive things he had ever witnessed, which she received with the directness she received most compliments. She said thank you, and she meant it. The land came alive under their combined effort. Section 14 was the showpiece of it, Eudora's original claim, first broken, now deep in the rhythm of a good farm, with fields that produced reliably, fencing that was tight and properly placed, and a kitchen garden that was known in Caldwell for its quality because she sold surplus at the market on Fridays, and people planned their visits around when her stand would be there. Silas's Section 15 had become a working cattle operation, small by the standards of the big ranches to the west but steady and well managed, with a small herd of good quality shorthorns that he had begun building toward registered breeding stock. He had a gift for cattle, for understanding them, for seeing what a good animal could become. That was different from but equal to Eudora's gift for the land, and together the two operations made a kind of economic whole that was more stable than either would have been separately. Cruz and Maria were still on the neighboring claim, Cruz working partly for Silas and partly farming his own ground, and their son Eduardo was growing up alongside Thomas in the way that children on neighboring homesteads always do, in and out of each other's houses, sharing work and play without clear distinction between them. In the fall of 1884, Eudora was 31 years old and she was expecting again. She told Silas on the same porch where she had told him the first time, in the same autumn light, and he looked at her with the same gladness, and she thought, "This is the thing that is strange about great happiness, that it can be repeated without diminishing, that it is not a finite thing divided by repetition, but something that simply continues to be full." Their daughter was born in the spring of 1885, April again. The Bailey family apparently had a preference for April, and they named her Clara, for Silas's mother who had played the fiddle on the porch in the Virginia evenings. Clara was nothing like Thomas in temperament, which was immediately apparent. Where Thomas was deliberate and watchful, Clara was loud and certain and opinionated from approximately her third day of life. She liked being held and she liked making her preferences known, and she had no patience whatsoever with anything she found unsatisfactory. "She's exactly like you," Silas said, looking at his daughter in his arms. "She is not," Eudora said. "I have considerably more patience." "In public," Silas said. Eudora considered this. "In public," she allowed. He grinned at her over Clara's head, and she grinned back, and it was the grin of two people who are fully known to each other and completely glad about it. Thomas was 4 years old when his sister arrived, and he regarded her with the solemn, slightly baffled attention of a 4-year-old who has been the center of things and is now adjusting to not being so. He was very gentle with her from the beginning, which nobody had coached him to be. It was simply his character, that careful attention he'd been born with. He would sit beside her and watch her with his gray Eudora eyes and sometimes talk to her very seriously about the chickens, or the creek, or whatever he had been occupied with that day, as though she were entirely capable of following the conversation, which she seemed to find acceptable. Summer of 1885 was good, better than good. The sorghum on Section 16 was performing beyond her projections, and she expanded it further. And the cattle on 15 won a quality ribbon at the county fair in Caldwell in October, which Silas accepted with dignity, and Eudora was more excited about than he was, because she understood what it meant for the value of the breeding stock. She also, that fall, began teaching 2 afternoons a week. There was no school closer than 6 miles, and there were 4 children on neighboring claims who had no schooling at all. Eudora had always been the most educated person in her immediate vicinity. She was aware of this without being superior about it, and she set up a corner of her sitting room 2 afternoons a week and taught reading and arithmetic and geography to whoever showed up, which was usually between 4 and 7 children depending on the season and the work requirements of their families. This was not planned. It began because she saw a need and she filled it, which was how most of the things she did began. Silas watched her teach one afternoon from the doorway, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed, and when the children had gone home he said, "You're good at this." "It's straightforward," she said. "You find out what they know and you start from there." "Most people don't find it straightforward," he said. "Most people approach teaching by telling," she said. "You should listen first." He nodded slowly. "I'll remember that," he said in a tone that suggested he was filing it away for something else, not only the observation about teaching, and she let it go. The years turned. Caldwell itself changed around them. The long cattle drives up the Kisham Trail were slowing by the mid-1880s as the railroads pushed further south, and the nature of the town shifted accordingly. The rough edge of the trail town culture smoothing somewhat as farming families settled in and stayed. The Corliss brothers sold their range operation in 1886 and moved on Owen to parts unknown, Thomas to Oklahoma Territory, and young Ray, who had never quite become the menace his brothers were, to a small farm east of town where he married a schoolteacher, and by all accounts, turned out considerably better than his early trajectory had suggested. Eudora and Silas had 500 acres between them by 1887. 500 acres of Kansas that had been broken and planted and fenced and improved year by year, built into something real and lasting by two people who had both come to it alone, and with nothing but their own work and stubbornness to lean on. Thomas was 6. Clara was 2, and had recently discovered that she could open every door in the house, and was exercising this ability with enthusiasm. They had hired a young woman named Nettie from Caldwell to help in the mornings, which Eudora had resisted until Silas pointed out that she was running 2 farms, teaching 6 children twice a week, managing the household and being a mother, and that needing help with the morning tasks was not a failure of character but a simple acknowledgement of the limits of time. She had said, "I hate it when you're right about things I don't want to admit." He had said, "I know. I appreciate your allowing it." She had hired Nettie the following week. It was Nettie who was watching the children on the afternoon in October of 1887 when Silas came to find Eudora in the east field, where she was checking the fence line along Section 16. She saw him coming from a distance. She always recognized him at distance, by his particular way of moving, that careful, ground-reading gait of a man who grew up on mountain terrain and never entirely lost the habit of watching where he put his feet. He was carrying something. When he got closer, she saw it was an envelope. "Letter from Gerald Prout at the land office," he said. He was smiling, which was not the expression she would have expected for land office correspondence. She took the envelope and opened it. It was a notification of land value assessment, routine enough, but attached to it was a second document, a county record of adjacent claims, and in the list was something she had not seen before. The small parcel, 30 acres, that sat between Section 16 and the creek's eastern branch, the parcel that had been in litigation for years over a disputed inheritance, had finally been cleared and was available. 30 acres of bottomland, creek-fed. The richest ground in the area. She looked up at Silas. He was still smiling. "Well," he said, "how did you know before I opened it?" "Because Prout told me when I picked up the mail," he said. "He is still not particularly pleased to be dealing with us incidentally." "He will survive the displeasure," she said. "Silas." "Yes, that's 530 acres. "It is," he said. "Do we have the capital for the filing fees and the first-year improvements?" "We do," he said. "I checked the books this morning." She looked at the letter. She looked at the land rolling away from her in the October afternoon, gold and brown in hers, the creek glinting where it curved through the bottomland. She looked at Silas standing in front of her with his green eyes and his worn hat and his particular, attentive quality of presence that she had come to understand as the thing she loved most about him. Not a quality, really, but a commitment. The commitment to being fully present with her, seeing her, all of her, the proud and the stubborn and the fierce and the soft and everything between. She said, "Do you know what my father told me the year before he died? He said the land doesn't care who you are when you arrive. It only cares what you do while you're there." He was right, Silas said. "He was," she said. "I've been thinking about what we've done while we've been here." Folded the letter carefully. "I'd like to file on the 30 acres. "I thought you would," he said. "In both our names," she said. That was different from her usual practice, and she said it deliberately, clearly, so he understood it was deliberate. He went still for a moment. Then he said quietly, "Eudora." "It should be in both our names," she said. "This one, the one we've built together." She paused. "Everything I had before I fought for alone, and it's mine, and that's right. But this is ours. This is 8 years of ours. I want the record to say that." He crossed the distance between them, and he kissed her there in the east field in the October afternoon, with nobody watching but the meadowlarks and the cattle in the distance. And she kissed him back. And it was not a young, uncertain kiss. It was the kiss of two people who know each other completely and have chosen each other completely and will go on choosing each other with open eyes. They filed on the 30 acres in both names the following week. Gerald Prout looked at the dual filing with an expression of a man who has given up understanding certain things and has decided to simply process the paperwork. He stamped it. He handed it back. He said congratulations in the same tone he had used 8 years before, and this time Eudora found she genuinely did not mind, because it did not matter what he thought. It had never really mattered what he thought. It had only ever mattered what she thought, and what she and Silas had built between them. They drove home in the wagon, Silas driving, Eudora beside him with the paperwork in her coat, Thomas sitting between them eating an apple with great concentration, Clara asleep against Eudora's side in the trusting, absolute way that sleeping children have, and the afternoon light came long and golden across the Kansas grass, and the creek was visible in the distance, running through the bottomland that was now theirs. "Tell me something," Silas said. "What do you want to know?" she said. "Are you happy?" he said. It was not a trivial question. He asked it the way he asked the things that mattered, directly, wanting the real answer. She looked at the land. She looked at Thomas and his apple and his serious face, so like hers. She looked at Clara sleeping with one small fist curled against her mother's coat. She looked at Silas, his profile against the afternoon sky, the gray at his temples, the slight weathered lines at the corners of his eyes, the hands on the reins that had helped build 3 walls of a cabin foundation in a single evening, and had played his mother's fiddle in the autumn, and had held her through the best and difficult nights alike. "I am," she said. Not with surprise, the way people say it when happiness catches them off guard. With certainty. With the same flat, clear certainty with which she said everything important. "I am completely happy." He reached over and covered her hand with his where it rested on the wagon seat, and she turned her hand and held his, and they drove home like that through the gold October afternoon of Kansas, 1887, on a road they knew every foot of, toward a place that was entirely theirs. That winter was mild, which in Kansas was a gift not to be questioned or examined too closely lest it be revoked. They spent the evenings in their usual way, Thomas with a picture book that Eudora read to him, until he could read it himself, which was happening faster than she had expected because he was quick and relentless about things he wanted. Clara usually in Silas's lap, because she had decided at some point that the lap was the correct place to be, and she was not open to revision on the subject. Silas played the fiddle on Fridays. He had gotten better over the years, not much better technically, but better in the way of someone who has relaxed into the instrument, who plays for the pleasure of it rather than for any standard. Thomas had recently decided he wanted to learn, and Silas had begun teaching him with a patience that Eudora found moving, the way he broke each thing into its smallest parts and rebuilt it, never making the boy feel slow, only showing him the next step. She taught Clara letters in the same way, finding where she was and starting there. Clara was already 2.5 and already opinionated about the letters, which she had decided to approach as a personal challenge, not a cooperative exercise. She would sit with the primer and glare at the page, with an expression of absolute determination that Eudora recognized in her bones. "She's going to read everything in the house before she's 5, Silas said one evening, watching Clara with the primer. Before she's 4, Eudora said. They looked at each other over their children's heads, and the look was one that contained everything. All of it. All 8 years and the fence dispute, and the blizzard and the fiddle music and the courthouse and the east field and the 30 acres, and every morning and every night, and every conversation, and every silence, and all of it. All of it held in a single look between two people who had built something real together and knew exactly what it was worth. Cruz's son, Eduardo, was 6 now and already a natural horseman, which delighted Cruz beyond all proportion, and which Silas was teaching him to channel into actual horsemanship rather than just fearless enthusiasm. Maria had another child on the way, their 3rd, and she and Eudora had had their usual conversation about it at the Friday market, which included Maria's characteristic frankness and Eudora's characteristic practical information and the deep, easy warmth between two women who have been through parallel things and emerged from them friends. In the spring of 1888, Eudora turned 35. She did not particularly mark birthdays. She was not sentimental about time in that way. But Silas had done something for it that she had not expected. He had framed the original stamped claim for Section 14, the paperwork she had carried into Caldwell in the spring of 1879, and hung it on the wall of the cabin's sitting room. She had stood in front of it for a long time when she first saw it. "That's where this all starts," he said behind her. "That's where I start," she said. "Yes," he said. "That's what I want Thomas and Clara to see when they look at that wall. Where their mother started and what she built." She did not cry. She was not a crier. It was another thing people said about her, and mostly it was true. But she felt something move through her that had the shape of tears even if it didn't have the fact of them. Some deep swell of feeling that acknowledged everything. The loneliness before this, the years of working alone, the Ohio farm and the Missouri years and the mortgage and the lawsuit and the Caldwell boardwalk and the fence and the blizzard and all of it, acknowledged all of it and released it. She reached back and found his hand and held it. "Thank you," she said. "For this, for all of it." "Thank you," he said. "For being exactly who you are." She turned and looked at him. He had a little more gray now at 37, and the lines at his eyes were a little deeper, and he was still the most attentive person she had ever known, still looking at her in that particular way, as though seeing her was something that continued to interest him, continued to be worthwhile. "I was described," she said, echoing his words from that November evening 6 years before by her stove with the first snow coming down, as proud and unbiddable. "Yes," he said. "You said those were the qualities you'd been looking for all along." "I did," he said, "and I was right. I've thought about that a great deal," she said, "what it means that those were the things." "What do you think it means?" he asked. He was always asking her what she thought. He had been asking her what she thought for 8 years, and he meant it every time. "I think it means you wanted a partner, not a ward," she said. "I think it means you wanted someone who would push back, who would be real with you, who would be interested in the same things rather than simply interested in you. Someone you could build something with rather than someone you built something for." "Yes," he said simply. "That is exactly what it means." She nodded. "I've never told you," she said, "but the reason I let myself, the reason I stopped resisting it last autumn, the first autumn, when I came across the creek to hear you play." "Tell me," he said. "Because you didn't come over," she said. "Because you were just playing on your porch for yourself, and the music came across the water, and it wasn't a performance for me. It was just you being real, and the sound of it came to me, and I came to it." She paused. "I had spent so long with people performing at me, telling me what they thought I should be, showing me what they thought I needed, that someone simply being genuine in their own space felt like something I had to go toward." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm glad you came." "So am I," she said. Outside, Thomas was calling from the yard something about the chickens, possibly another jailbreak. Clara had taken to opening the chicken coop for the philosophical satisfaction of doing so. And they went out together into the spring morning, into the specific noise and life of their household. And Eudora stood in the yard of the land she had built herself, and watched her husband chase her daughter away from the chicken coop, while her son watched from the fence with his arms crossed and his expression of small, grave authority. And the creek ran between the two properties, and the cottonwoods were coming into their new leaves, and the Kansas sky was blue and enormous overhead. She thought, this is it. This is exactly it. Not the absence of difficulty, there would be more difficulty, there always was. Not the end of work, there was always more work and she would always want to do it. Not even the achievement of some final, static condition of having arrived. It was something more continuous than arrival, more dynamic than a destination. It was the ongoing, alive, daily choosing this land, choosing this man, choosing this particular configuration of her own proud, unbiddable self in relation to other people she had chosen to let matter to her. She had not known, riding into Caldwell in the spring of 1879 with her rifle and her paperwork and her complete intention to need no one, that the bravest thing she would ever do was not any of the solitary things she was so good at. It was the harder thing, the thing that required more from her than stubbornness or self-sufficiency or pride. It was staying open. It was letting the music come across the water and going toward it. It was standing across a kitchen table from a man who was looking at her like she was real and specific and saying, yes, I love you. I have for months, saying it simply and directly and without apology, in the way she handled every important thing. Thomas had given up on whatever the chicken matter was and came to stand beside her, putting his hand into hers with the same directness she recognized as her own. He was 7 years old and already himself in the ways that people who know who they are always already themselves, and she looked down at him with something that was beyond love, or was love's full extension, the recognition of a whole separate person that you had a hand in making, and now had the pleasure and the terror of watching become. Is there school today? He asked. Not today, she said. Today we're doing the fence line on section 16. His eyes lit up. He loved fence work. He had Silas's instinct for doing things correctly. Can I use the hammer? He asked. If you mind what your father shows you, she said. I always mind, he said, which was so sincerely delivered and so largely untrue that she laughed. Silas appeared at her other side, Clara over his shoulder in the position Clara found acceptable when she'd lost the battle over the chickens. He caught Eudora's eye over Thomas's head and she shook her head at him, meaning, he just said he always minds, and Silas's eyes went bright with the suppressed laugh that she knew by now as one of her favorite things in the world. Fence line today, Silas said. Let's go, Eudora said. And they went, all four of them, across the spring morning of their land, toward the work and the day and the good, full, particular life they had built together out of 2 proud solitudes and 1 good fence dispute, and the sound of a fiddle drifting across a creek in the autumn of 1879. The 30 acres of bottomland were lush with new grass that spring, the creek-fed soil already showing what it would become. Thomas ran ahead to check the fence posts. Clara demanded to be put down, and then walked with great purpose in a direction that was neither correct nor efficient, which Silas followed without complaint. Eudora stood for a moment at the edge of the new ground, looking at it, this last piece, the one they had filed on together, the one that had both their names in the county record. She thought about Gerald Prout and his mustache and his assumptions, and she felt something she recognized as grace, not toward him exactly, but toward the version of herself who had walked into that land office and said what she needed, done what she came to do, and walked out without looking back. She had not needed to look back. She had not needed to because she had been building toward something worth looking forward to. 530 acres, 2 children, 1 good man. And 30 years ahead of her, at least, of Kansas mornings just like this one. Eudora. Silas called from down the fence line, where Thomas had apparently already gotten into the fence posts and needed parental adjudication. She walked toward the sound of his voice without hurrying, because she was not a woman who hurried unless the situation genuinely required it, and no situation today required it. She walked through the long spring grass of the bottomland they had filed on together, in both their names, because some things were exactly and specifically ours, and the record should say so. She walked toward her husband and her children and her 530 acres of Kansas, and the morning opened in front of her like the land itself, broad and bright, and full of what hard work and a clear eye and a proud, unbiddable heart could make of it. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.